And welcome to class. We are today talking about the Virgin Mary and who she is and what she does for us and all that kind of good stuff. We're also going to talk about some of Jesus' other family members, but the focus is going to be on the Virgin Mary because she's the most important. For the young kids, we have this book of the Feast of the Virgin Mary, or the Life of the Virgin Mary. So if you want to have any pictures from here, you can look through it, and you can make you some copies of whatever you want. The Fruits of the Spirit CD has a song for the Virgin Mary called Full of Grace, I think. So you can use that if you want. It's not really a sing-along song, it's more of one you listen to. So I don't know if you want to incorporate it to your lessons. There's also another song on Celebrate the Feast about the Feast of Mary, but that's going to be a lesson next year on the Feast of Mary, so I don't know if you want to use it this year. Alright, so let's talk about the Virgin Mary. One of the things I want the kids to get out of the Virgin Mary is not only who she is and dogmatically how we believe in her and that kind of thing, but more of a relational kind of thing with the Virgin Mary. It's how is she our mother? We call her our mother all the time. So how is she our mother? Everyone needs paper?
Do you want? Yeah. Do you want one though? You're making us write tonight.
Okay, so who can tell me some of the ways that we refer to Mary? Samantha?
Theotokos.
Theotokos. And what's that mean, literally?
Theo means God in Greek, and Theotokos means Mary.
God-bearer.
I think.
God-bearer. The bearer of God. Tokos means bearer, and Theo, like you said, is God. So the bearer of God. So this makes her, as we talked about in the Third Ecumenical Council, if you had talked about that with your kids, that's where the term Theotokos came from, because the Virgin Mary was more than the bearer of Jesus or the bearer of Christ. She's the bearer of God, and so that's a big deal. And if she becomes the mother of God, she becomes the mother of us all, because God is our Father and He created us. Not that she gave birth to the Father. We have to make sure that we understand she gave birth to the Son, but He is one with the Father and the Spirit. And so if she's the bearer of God, then she's the mother of all creation. So that's another title for her, the mother of creation. Any other titles you can think of?
Blessed Virgin.
Blessed Virgin, okay. So we call her the Ever Virgin sometimes,
Virgin.
because she was a virgin before, during, and after the life of Christ. She was the Ever Virgin. Any other names that you're...
Unwedded.
Unwedded bride, okay. She was never wed. She was betrothed to Joseph, but more importantly, she remained a virgin. She never had any children. How about right above the altar table, like in the apse? How do we refer to her? In Greek, platitera ton uranon. In English, more spacious than the heavens. Because in Arabic, arhaba min as-samawat. Because she was more spacious than the heavens in the sense that Him who the heavens could not contain, who is Christ, was contained in the Virgin's womb. So we think about things spaciously, like, this room can hold something, the church can hold something bigger. But her womb, which size-wise is probably pretty small, right? But can contain what the heavens couldn't. So you have kind of like a paradoxical miracle, or almost like what would be like considered almost an oxymoron. Things that don't really make sense, but they do, because they are reality. So what God, or what the heavens couldn't contain, the Virgin's womb was able to contain. We sometimes refer to her as a heifer. You think, that doesn't sound very nice. More specifically, a 3-year-old heifer. Why? You'll hear that in the Akathist hymn when we are singing, chanting hymns to her. Why? Because Hold on, I had it here somewhere. Um, can't remember where it is. But anyway, 3-year-old animals were often, it was the perfect age, considered the perfect age of when they would be sacrificed to God. And for a cow or a heifer, to be sacrificed at 3 years old was like ideal. It was like a great sacrifice. So what happened to the Virgin Mary at 3 years old?
She was committed to the temple.
She entered into the temple
Right.
at 3 years old. And that was, what did you do with a sacrifice, an animal sacrifice in the Jewish tradition?
The 2 pigeons.
Well, there were different kinds of,
Okay.
but where did you take them?
The temple?
The temple.
Yeah.
The Virgin Mary was actually taken to the temple when she was younger. I think, I'm not sure, don't quote me on this, but 40 days old. But it was rejected that she go in at that point. So she came back at 3 years old as a symbol of being a perfect sacrifice. All right, good. Any other names? There are actually so many names for the Virgin Mary, and if you open up the Akathist service, you hear her being referred to. You hear her being called the ladder connecting earth to heaven, because that's really what she did. Heaven and earth were like 2 different places where God was up here and mankind was down here, and she was the connection where she brought God to mankind, and because of her, mankind could then go up to God. So there are all these different terms of honor. We say that she is the holiest person to have ever lived. We say she's more honorable than the cherubim and more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. What's that mean? What are seraphim and cherubim? They are
Angels.
angels. And they're not only angels, they're the highest rank of angels. So in the hierarchy of angels, the cherubim and the seraphim are the 2 highest. And the Virgin Mary is more honorable than both of them, and more glorious than both of them. So that's really saying something about who she is. Now, we say that a priest is ranked higher than an angel because he could do something that the angels can't, and that's call down the Holy Spirit to transform bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. But to be more honored and more glorious than the angels, that's something different. And she's higher than them. If you remember from the Gospel, I believe it is Mark chapter 10, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, asked Christ that they be granted to sit at his right and left hand in his kingdom. And Christ refuses them that. He says, this is set for the people for whom it's been set by the Father. The tradition of the church is that the person sitting at Christ's right hand is the Virgin Mary. So if you look at the iconostas, you have Christ, right? And who's on his right side is the Virgin Mary. Where does that come from? If you read the Psalms, I believe it was Psalm 44. And I can't find anything in my notes here. But I believe it's Psalm 44 says, at the right hand sat the queen. And that was David talking. It was a prophecy about the Virgin Mary sitting at Christ's right hand. And so that's why she is where she is on the altar, on the iconostas. And that's where her place is. Actually, Father Nabil shared something kind of cool with me yesterday. Have you all heard of that movie that just came out, Heaven is for Real?
Mm-hmm.
So in the book that was written, the little boy, his dad was a Protestant minister, or is a Protestant minister, and so a lot of people were asking them questions about what he saw, and so one question was, did he see Mary up in heaven? You know, the Protestants, they believe in Mary. They believe that Mary was Jesus' mother, but they kind of stop there. They don't hold her in very high regard. And so the father was asking his son, did you see Mary? And the boy's response, and this was in the book, I don't think it's in the movie, according to father, I haven't seen the movie yet. He says, yeah, I saw Mary. And he said sometimes she was listening to God, to Christ as her God. Sometimes she was the mother, though. And sometimes she was sitting down next to him on his right side. So for a Protestant to say something like that, first of all, it's like, wow. But this little kid who really doesn't know, he wouldn't have studied this anywhere. No one would have told him, and he wouldn't have heard it from his church. For him to have seen this is pretty remarkable. And that was his answer about the Virgin Mary. Okay, so if we look at the Old Testament is full of prophecies about Christ and his life, and also there are plenty about the Virgin Mary. So a type of the Virgin Mary, do you know what I mean by a type? It means somebody or something that was a prefiguring of something in the New Testament. So for example, Jonah in the belly of the whale for 3 days is a type of Christ in Hades for 3 days. You see how that works?
Mm-hmm.
Now, can you please close the door? The AOL login sound is driving me nuts from the other office. That's good enough. It's like the
So
spin the
say
wheel
over
on
again
Price is
what
Right.
you just said.
So
Yeah, can you say
a type of something is a prophecy of something, or like a symbol of it. So Jonah in the belly of the whale for 3 days is a type of Christ in the belly of the earth, or in Hades for 3 days. And you have tons of those. You have the Israelites crossing the Red Sea is a type of baptism, where they cross through water in order to be saved. You see how that works?
Mm-hmm.
So Eve from the Old Testament is a type of the Virgin Mary. Now you might think to yourself, wait a minute, Eve made a mistake and sinned. Why would she be a type of the Virgin Mary? Well, the name Eve means source of life, first of all, because she was the first woman, and that's who life came from. And so in some ways, she's just like the Virgin Mary, and like a type of the Virgin. In other ways, she's the opposite. So it was kind of through Eve that sin entered into the world, right? Adam and Eve. But Eve gave the fruit to Adam and told him to eat it. But it's through the Virgin Mary that this sin, the curse, was reversed. So Christ is often known as the new Adam, Adam, which literally just means man, and Eve, which means the source of life. So you have Christ is the new Adam, the Virgin Mary is the new Eve. And they're kind of the fulfillment of Adam and Eve. And they corrected the mistakes of Adam and Eve. But more than that, Eve, what were her children's names? The ones we know about.
Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel. But then Cain killed Abel. And God gave them a replacement. What was the name of the replacement son? Seth.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Seth was sent to replace Abel. And the name Seth means resurrection. So Eve, the source of life, is the birth giver to resurrection. The Virgin Mary is the birth giver to the resurrection, who brought resurrection to the entire world. You see how that works? Okay. So the Virgin Mary is a type of Eve. The Virgin Mary, Eve is a type of the Virgin Mary, not the other way around. Another type of the Virgin Mary is Sarah. Actually, Sarah was a type of Anne, the Virgin Mary's mother, who was barren until very old age. We remember that the Virgin Mary's mother, Anna, didn't have any children until very old age. Now we'll talk about Jesus' family tree a little bit. So if you look at your family tree that I printed out, it takes a little bit of explanation, and so that's what I'm going to do for you right now. So if you look at the icon of the Virgin Mary holding Christ, right over here, that's Christ and the Virgin Mary. So I didn't write down their names, but that's where they are. You go back a generation, you see the parents of the Virgin Mary, who are Joachim and Anna. Now there's some important stuff that goes on here. Anna comes from the tribe of Levi, which was a priestly tribe. So in order to be a priest, you have to come from the tribe of Levi. See that like yellow star thing up there? It says Levi. So that's where she comes from. Joachim is from the tribe of Judah, which is a royal tribe, which is the tribe that David came from. Joachim and Anna got married, but it was actually against Jewish law for the tribes to mix. So Levites were supposed to marry Levites, and people from the tribe of Judah were supposed to marry people from the tribe of Judah. They weren't supposed to mix, but Joachim and Anna did mix. And they didn't have children for many, many years. So at one point, Joachim brings a sacrifice to the temple, and the priest says, "No, we're not accepting your sacrifice. You've been cursed by God because you don't have any children." So Joachim is very upset over this. He withdraws into the wilderness for 40 days. Anna thinks her husband's died somewhere because he was an old man and didn't come home. And so she's crying and she's saying, "I've been doubly cursed. I'm a widow and barren." So this went on for 40 days before angels came and spoke to them. Anyway, I don't want to get too much into the story. But the main point was the tribes mixed, which wasn't supposed to happen. But as we will later see, it was necessary for it to happen because Christ is both a priest. Remember, Christ is from the order of a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, but he's also a king. And that comes from the lineage of Judah, which also David came from. And we know Christ is a descendant of David. From both Joseph's side, even though Joseph was just his stepfather, but also from Joachim. So the two marry, they have Mary, and you can see actually that the Virgin Mary comes from a line of priests. So Anna's father, his name was Mathan, and he was a priest. Zoia, who is a sister of Anna, married someone who we don't know what his name is, or at least I couldn't find it, who was a son of Levi, which means from the tribe of Levi. And they had a daughter, Elizabeth, who turned out to be John the Baptist's father. Zachariah was also a priest. So you have Elizabeth and Zachariah. So you can see that like all the priests are on the one side of the family. Anyway, going back to the Virgin Mary, you see that she was betrothed to Joseph. Now Joseph, you see in the different genealogies that he has two different fathers, one in Matthew and one in Luke. So I was talking about that a little earlier before the class started. Why is that? It's because according to Jewish law, Joseph's father is the person who was married to his mother first, and that was Eli. So Eli was married to Joseph's mother, but then he died without having children, and so Jacob married the mother, and so he's the biological father of Joseph, but according to the law, the father is Eli. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's just a little bit of the family tree. The red line you see from Levi, coming down from Levi, you see how the two families are kind of interrelated. Okay, and as we know from even Arab families, we know it's
Even
not
the family.
it's not very uncommon for people to be married
Cousin.
to their cousins or something. But let's move on to Joseph, because this is interesting too. Joseph was married to a woman named Salome, and they had 7 children. One of those children is James, who we sometimes know as the brother of the Lord. If you see this icon right here, down here with the Virgin Mary sitting on a donkey, that's the icon called the Flight to Egypt, where Joseph is taking the Virgin Mary and Christ to Egypt. But with them, that young man with them, is St. James, Christ's stepbrother, who we know as the brother of the Lord, and he was the first bishop of Jerusalem. Then you have Jude, who was one of the apostles you hear about. And then if you go over a little bit, you have Salome, who is one of Joseph's daughters, and she marries a man named Zebedee, and they have 2 children named James and John. These are James and John, the apostles of Christ. And John was the person who was with Christ at the cross, and he's the beloved disciple. So he was related to Christ. Interesting stuff, huh?
This Simon that's here is not Simon Peter.
No, that's not Simon Peter. Simon Peter was a brother of Andrew.
Okay.
So that's a little bit on Christ's family tree. And I don't know how, and if you want to at all, tie this into your lesson. Just to kind of show a little relation between Christ and some of the other people we hear about in the Bible. Alright, let's see. So, the life of the Theotokos. She's a very special person, obviously. Did you ever wonder why Christ came into the world right when he came into the world and not before? Because all the people, you're like, no, I never thought of that. But all the people who were dying before Christ died were going to Hades. But things had to be set up just right for Christ to come into the world. For one thing, the Jewish nation had reached its like rock bottom. Things had never gotten so bad. Rome was had taken over Palestine, the whole Palestine region. The Jews had to, they were in submission to Rome, and it was a very unpleasant time, and they were looking for a Messiah to save them. Well, it also had to be set up from a family point of view that it was just right, that Christ had to be a descendant from the lineage of David. He had to be both a priest and a king, and he had to be born from just the right person. So there's a hymn around Christmas, or a Christmas hymn, that says, "What shall we offer thee, O Christ?" And it goes on to say that the earth offers a cave, the angels offer a song, the shepherds offer their wonder, the wilderness offers a manger, and human beings offer to you a virgin mother. In other words, we offer to you the best of our entire race. This is it, and it's Mary. And so it had to be the Virgin Mary. She was just set up perfectly. She lived in the temple her whole life up until the time that she was pregnant with Christ. Some sources say a little before, but she was raised in prayer and reading scripture and fasting and all that kind of stuff. By the way, a lot of the roots or the stories from the Virgin Mary's life we get from a book called the Proto-Evangelion, which means the first gospel, and it was written by St. James. So he records a lot of her early life. So we look at her life. She was born again from Joachim and Anna, and at 3 years old she's brought into the temple, and she's entered in there by the priest, who is Zechariah, who is married to Elizabeth, her cousin, her first cousin. So she goes into the temple, she lives there for her whole life, and that's really, and this is a good point to bring up with the kids, this is what prepared her to make the right decision as far as bearing God, accepting to have God in her womb, is that she went to church, and she actually lived in church. And by praying and fasting and living a certain way, you prepare yourself so that you can say yes to God. Because what if she would have said no to God? We would have all been in a lot of big trouble. So that's how she knew to say yes to God, and that's how she knew what God's will was, is by living in the temple, growing up in the temple. Let's see. Joseph was much older, and this is the Orthodox tradition. He was an old man, around maybe 80 years old, when he was betrothed to the Virgin Mary, because he had been previously married, and he had children, and his wife had died, and so he was chosen by a miracle to be the Virgin Mary's husband. Although we don't have anything that says they were ever married, they were just betrothed. Which in the Orthodox Church we still have the betrothal. Does anyone know when we do the betrothal? You could do it and at any point, but nowadays we do it right before the wedding, because if you're betrothed and you break up, you actually have to get a full divorce granted from the church. So let's say I was betrothed, and then I broke up with the person I was betrothed to. I couldn't be a priest anymore because I'd be considered divorced. So they consider it like a very serious thing, and that's why we don't betroth people to each other until the time of the wedding, and we do it as part of the same service.
Oh, so it's like during that.
It's during the
Oh,
wedding
okay.
service. But in some places they still do it as a separate thing. So, anyway, the Virgin Mary and Joseph were betrothed. She remained a virgin her whole life. And Joseph, at one point, when she was told at the Annunciation that she was going to have a son by the Holy Spirit, Joseph didn't believe it, and the Bible tells us that he sought to divorce her quietly, because he was a righteous man too. He didn't want to embarrass her, and more than that, the penalty for adultery was stoning. So he didn't want her to have to be killed for it, but he wanted to divorce her as the honorable thing to do, because he didn't see that it was right for him to, be with an adulteress. So he was doing what would have been the right thing. But an angel came to him and said, "She didn't cheat on you. This is really God's son, and He's chosen you to raise the son, in a sense." So, anyway.
How old was Mary when they were betrothed? When she went?
14 or 15.
Okay.
She was very young. It's actually canonically the church. I think I told the teens this at the vigil. The church's canonical age to get married is 12 for women and 14 for boys.
So Oops.
Forget it, you and I are dead already.
We are.
So,
Oh boy.
You want to get on it?
so anyway, we look at the Virgin Mary though, and what do we see? We see her life really becomes important because of who she is in the life of Christ. She brought Christ to the world, right? But she's even more than that. And she's more than that because that's who God made her. So one of the most important stories to look at her relationship with Christ, and in turn her relationship with us, is the wedding in Cana of Galilee. That was Christ's first, in the book of John, his first miracle. And it was like kind of the beginning of his public ministry. So they're at a wedding, him and his disciples, and his mother is there. And they run out of wine. And the Virgin Mary tells Christ, "They're out of wine, take care of it." And his response to her is negative. He says, "My hour has not yet come. What have you to do with me?" It's kind of a weird response, but if you jump forward a bunch of chapters, you realize what he was talking about. How does he refer to his passion? This cup. Father talked about that in one of his sermons last week. He says to the Father, "If it is your will, take this cup from me." And he talks about to the disciples about drinking from the same cup that he drinks from. It's not like a physical cup to drink from. It's the cup of his death. And so he thinks that his mother is talking to him, especially with wine, talking about the shedding of his blood, right? "Drink all of you, this is my blood of the new covenant," which was the wine transformed to the blood of Christ. So anyway, she says they're out of wine. He says, "Woman, what have you to do with me? My hour is not yet come." But then, she didn't even have to say anything anymore. He listened to her right away. What did he do? He went and changed water into wine. In other words, he wasn't maybe even ready to start doing these things yet, but he listened to his mother. There's a beautiful icon, I wish I printed a picture of it, of the Virgin Mary holding Christ's hand like this. And there's a story, and I don't remember the details exactly, but there was a place either in Turkey or in Greece or something where a few hundred years ago, they were going to be attacked by an outside people. And they were very sinful, the people in this town. They were Orthodox, they were Christians, but they were living in sin. But when they were going to be attacked, they started praying to the Virgin Mary. and someone was praying in front of this icon of the Virgin Mary, and they said, "Please help us." And so she said, "Okay, well, I'm going to help you." And Christ, in the icon started moving, took his finger and put it over his mom's mouth and said, "No, they're sinful." And she took his hand and moved it away and said, "No, we're going to help them." And so that shows the power, and this is the Orthodox tradition, that even though he is her God, she is his mother. And there's a very powerful image of what the mother is like. And you see that with the wife of King David, Bathsheba, who was married to David. And when she's talking to David, she is submissive as a wife. But the same person, when she talks to Solomon, who's also king, years later, he comes off the throne and bows down before her because she's his mother. And so we have that also as a type of the Virgin Mary. Isn't that something? So Christ realizes this, and he always honors his mother in a very honorable way. Don't forget, he chose her to be his mother. It's most kids don't get to choose who their mother is going to be, but he chose her as the perfect mother, and so he listens to her when she tells him something. And so this is why we pray to the Virgin Mary, and a lot of non-Orthodox Christians have a very hard time with people praying to the Virgin Mary, especially when we say, "Most Holy Theotokos, save us." Say, how can a human being save? Only God saves. Say, yes, only God saves. We are not arguing with that. But the Virgin Mary, through her intercession, has Christ save us. Now, why do we do that? Why don't we just go straight to Christ? Well, that story with the icon is a good example. Sometimes Christ, who is the judge of the universe, says, "No, you're getting what you deserve." But a mother is compassionate. And even though we get what we deserve sometimes, just think of like a Middle Eastern mother. Habibi. It's like, come here, I love you. That's okay. It'll be okay. So we go to the Virgin Mary a lot of times, especially when we know we've really been bad, and we're like, okay, now please help us, and she'll tell her son, okay, I want you to help him. And that's why that little boy, that wrote the book with his father, said sometimes, Christ, she would talk to Christ like he was God, but other times she would talk to him like she's his mother. And that's really how the Orthodox see it, that there's both that, give and take, I guess. So, anyway, it's kind of a mystery in a certain sense, but it's the way God wanted it. The Virgin Mary is also a prototype to women, and this is another important aspect, especially for the older kids, middle school and high school, to understand that this is their example of what a woman should be. Not Michelle Obama, not, I'm not saying Michelle Obama is good or bad, but if you want a role model, this is really who your role model is. So people who, sometimes I think maybe in humility they're saying this, but sometimes you ask a woman what she does for a living, she'll say, "Oh, I'm just a mom." Just a mom? I think any mom would tell you that there's no such thing as just a mom. In fact, this is something you might be able to use in your class. There was something online, like a YouTube clip, on an interview for the hardest job in the world. Did any of you see that? It was posted on Facebook. It's really neat. Interview for the hardest job in the world. And so this guy is doing like webcam interviews, and he's pretty much describing the job details, and the people who are being interviewed are like, this doesn't sound fair, or this doesn't sound right. And so finally it comes out that he's interviewing for like the job of a mom. And so it's really like a powerful kind of idea of what is a mom, And the Virgin Mary, if you watch The Passion of the Christ, one of the things that's really shown in that movie is how much the Virgin Mary suffers because, of Christ's suffering. And I've been to funerals where the mother is still alive of the deceased, and there's nothing harder than to watch the mother during her child's funeral. And so you really I think Mel Gibson does a good job in the movie showing the Virgin Mary's just horror. And Saint Simeon, who brought Christ into the temple, predicts this. He says, "A sword will pierce your heart," because when the Virgin Mary gave birth, she actually felt no pain during the birth giving. Must be nice, huh? But because she didn't feel that, she still felt the pain. It just wasn't at that time. It was when her son was on the cross. Her perfect son was being killed for being perfect, and that was when she felt that pain even worse than childbearing. And so anyway, you get to see her as the role of a mother, which is more important than any career, and that's to raise your children.
So we were perfect when we were born because our mothers felt pain.
Where what? I'm sorry.
Were we like perfect when we were born because our mothers felt pain?
What do you mean by that?
Like my mom was in pain when she had me.
Yeah, but what do you mean like we were perfect?
Like you said that.
You weren't
Because
perfect.
she went through the pain to
Maybe I'm confused.
have a child.
I just don't know what that has to do with being perfect.
Well, Jesus was perfect.
Yeah.
Well,
No.
was he like punished for being?
He was punished for being perfect.
He
Oh,
was-
so never mind.
He was punished. He was punished for being God. They called it blasphemy. I guess I didn't phrase that very well, but no, that has nothing to do with why she felt the pain.
Oh, okay.
Like I was saying, part of her pain is like, you know how every mother thinks their kid's like an angel. Well, maybe not, but some mothers, they think that their girls are good.
They are good. They are. Trying.
But I mean, imagine you have a kid who's being punished for something they really didn't do. You'd flip out. Well, Christ, who's perfect, who never sinned in his life, is being killed unjustly, and so can you imagine the pain in her heart at that point? That's kind of what I was trying to get at.
We're not perfect members.
Darn.
Now,
My mom tells me that.
men and women are created equally in God's eyes. This is very important. He loves them the same. One is not better than the other, but He created them different, and so their roles are different. At the fall of Adam and Eve, their punishments were different. And the Virgin Mary is a great example of what a woman should be like.
You said they're created equally, but they're not treated equally.
No, they're treated equally by God,
But they're different. That's
but
what you said.
they're different. Their roles are different, both anatomically and physically, emotionally and spiritually. Men and women are different, and we have to see that different. And we're living in a world that ignores that difference, and that's why we have gender confusion. Really, we're living in a world where men are being told to act like women, and women are told to act like men, and it's very confusing then to kids who are growing up being confused. So there's so much to be said about Mary. I wanted to keep today short. Not to mention I couldn't prepare anything last week because of Holy Week. So today, in my half asleep state, I'm tried to throw something together.
I was going to say.
Any questions about Mary or anything I taught or any other things that you always wondered about her? One thing you can teach your kids in the icon of Mary, you see 3 stars on her forehead and 2 shoulders. That represents her virginity before, during, and after the life of Christ. So that's something you can point out to them.
So anything we could read, you mentioned the one gospel, anything we can read online is supplement to what you've done here tonight if we had a desire to.
Yeah, there's an
Right.
article I'll send you. Fathers seem to like it a lot, called Facing Up to Mary. It was written by Father Peter Gilchrist years ago.
Okay.
So I'll send you that. Another thing is to look at the life of the Virgin Mary after Christ died, because she stayed alive for a while afterwards. One thing is she lived with St. John, who Christ gave her at the cross to him to take care of. He said, "Woman, behold your son," and "Son, behold your," or "John, behold your mother." So they lived together, and he took care of her. But she was the mother of the disciples at that point. And when she died, the apostles came from all over the world, wherever they were, to come back for her funeral. And they had been called mysteriously. I can't remember. I think it was an angel that had called them to come back to her, to see her as she passed away. And the last one to show up was Thomas. He missed the funeral. He's always missing things. But Thomas, actually, because he came late, he asked them to take her, or to open up the tomb, because he wanted to go pay his final respects. And they realized that she wasn't there. What was happening is she was ascending up into heaven
Oh.
with her whole body. And as she was ascending, she took off her belt and dropped it down to them. And so that belt still exists till today. It's in a monastery, I forgot, somewhere in Greece. And they call it Aia Skepi in Greek, which means the holy protection. And so there's a feast just for her belt, where we celebrate her protection of the people. And there are icons where she's like standing on top of Mount Athos as the protector of, or the protectress of Mount Athos. But in most icons of the Virgin Mary, you'll notice, unless it's like a scene from her life before Christ was born, you'll never see her without Christ in the icon. Christ is always in an icon with the Virgin Mary. Because her life was about him. And usually in the icon she's pointing to him. She's going like this. She's holding him and pointing like this, saying, here's the one. Okay? Any other questions?